Hi, I'm Tracy Fessenden. I'm co-director of the Recovering Truth Project, and I'm here today talking with my ASU colleague, Sarah Viren. Sarah is a former journalist with the Houston Chronicle. She left journalism to get an MFA at the University of Iowa in creative nonfiction. She is the author of the multiple award-winning book of essays called Mine, which won the River Teeth Book Prize, was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award, and was longlisted for the 2019 Penn Diamondstein Spielvogel Award for the art of the essay. She is the recipient of a 2020 fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts for her new book called Autobiography of Shadows. It is a loose retelling of Plato's allegory of the cave, focused on conspiracy theories and alternative facts, and that will be coming out on Scribner. Sarah is also the author of a searing essay in the New York Times Magazine called The Accusation, which appeared in March, just as our Recovering Truth Project was ready to launch. And that essay tells the story of Sarah's wife, who was accused of sexual harassment by figures who were, it turned out, fictional. They were the creations of someone who wanted to make your lives very difficult because it was someone who wanted your job. And so the through line through all of these projects is really, it's something that you touch on in the New York Times piece very beautifully, is the responsibility of a creative nonfiction writer in a post-truth world. So Sarah Viren, we're delighted that you will be part of our project on Recovering Truth. And I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit about how your current book or your projects or your ongoing preoccupations make a nice fit with our project on Recovering Truth.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to be part of this project. I think it's sort of ideal for me where I am right now because I started out as a newspaper reporter, as you mentioned, and what I really loved about the work was the service, the form of writing as service and being able to communicate the news in a way that would sort of help a local community. And I started at a very small paper in which I was on an island with 1,000 other people, and I reported the news and people immediately talked about it. And we had this sort of relationship between audience and writer. And then I ended up at the Houston Chronicle, which is one of the largest newspapers in the country, with a very different relationship with readers. But during those 6 years, what I kept thinking about and the question that kept coming to my head, and sort of ultimately the reason I left journalism, is that I didn't, although I was factual in my reporting and that I always sought to tell the truth, I didn't always feel like I was honest, like I could be honest. And I think because what I finally realized was because at that point, especially, journalists were supposed to be invisible. And the idea was that in order to be objective, you didn't exist. You gathered the news, you wrote the story that was based on the facts, and you sort of tried to tell both sides and be as fair as you could. But there was no acknowledgement of who you were as a person, which I think is something that we're starting to reckon with a little bit more recently. But at that time, we weren't really. And so I ultimately left journalism in 2018 and I got my MFA. And there I focused on the personal essay, which allowed me to think about telling a true story in a different way. Because the difference between the essay, which comes from Montaigne, who's the original essayist, and newspaper writing is that the I is present and centered. And so it's ultimately what I had, sort of my hands, this experience was these two different versions of telling a true story. One is objectivity, almost sort of this idea that we could be scientific in our ability to tell the story. And the other is, sort of literary, and this idea of sort of centering the self or the narrator or whoever it is. But I think as I continued to write the personal essay, I also could see flaws in that. I mean, I think that that's the question we have when we're trying to figure out what the truth is or how to tell a true story, is that there are always flaws. We never get to that ideal form. And so when I started work on this current book, and then when I sort of got sidelined working on the New York Times piece that ultimately will be part of this book, what I started to think about at that point was, what does it mean? How can I be honest instead of trying to tell the truth? So that's something that I started to think about, is what does it mean to be honest with a reader and telling a story? And how is that different than being factual or being truthful? And so a lot of what this book is about is trying to sort of widen our vocabulary for thinking about truth and factuality, because sometimes we say those interchangeably. We say, oh, there's facts, there's truth, but they're not the same thing, and neither is honesty. I mean, we actually have a large vocabulary for talking about different forms of being truthful, and we also have, if we think about it, we also have a lot of fluency for thinking about truth in different ways depending on the context. So for me, I've been thinking, now I'm writing this memoir, which is a slightly different form than the essay. And I've been thinking, okay, in a memoir, what does that mean? It's based on memory. It's a story of a portion of the self. What does it mean to be truthful within memoir? And how is that different than maybe how I was truthful or honest within an essay? And how can I not just know that myself, but I think a project for me has been thinking about communicating that to readers and getting readers to think alongside me about those same questions. Because I think for me, that feels like an important project, is not that you have a set of rules in your head and you figure out, this is how I'm honest or this is how I'm truthful, but that you engage with those questions within the text itself, and you ask the reader to engage as well with those questions, because I think that's the way we'll move forward. I don't think the way we'll move forward was necessarily everybody sort of throwing down their definition of what truth is and then declaring somebody else a liar. I think it'll come through us actually sort of engaging in a discussion about these different sort of maybe liminal points, or these moments where we're not quite sure, is something factual, is something truthful, is that honest, etc.
Could you say a little bit about the title of your first book, Mine? Obviously, that speaks to the work of the memoirist to do that digging, but also to center the self, to center one's own story. That was a collection of essays, and now you're moving on to memoir, something that sounds like an intensification of that project. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one distinction I've always liked about the difference between memoir and essay is that the idea that the essay uses the self as a lens to understand the external world, and that memoir uses the external world in order to understand the self, which is, so the self is in both of those forms, but it's very distinct. And so that's the way I've always envisioned the difference. And so in Mine, mine was a verb, this idea of mining sort of the past and mining my experiences and experiences of others in order to get at some larger questions that I've had for a while. But it also was the idea of the possessive. And it came to me when I had some of the essays written. I was trying to think about what is the central question that they're getting at. Because essay collections they're also different forms in that they're a collection rather than one full narrative. So a memoir is one story that you're trying to figure out how to tell over the length of a book. An essay is these parts that come together in a collection, and you're trying to figure out, how does this collection speak to it? How do the pieces speak to the whole? And so with that project, I started to think, what am I trying to think through? And I think a big question I had leaving journalism, because the essay collection sort of came out of that moment of leaving journalism, was what is the distinction between my own story and other people's stories? I'd spent 6 years as a journalist telling other people's stories. And so what does it mean to call a story my own? Because theoretically, it's a collection of stories that are all my own. But one question in that book was a lot about responsibility. Okay, our own stories are always going to encompass other people's stories. And so when we tell our own stories and they include other people's stories, what responsibility do you have towards those people? What right do you have to their lives and their stories? And I think that's another, if there are two large moral questions in creative nonfiction, one is this question of truth, and the other is, I think, this question of moral or ethical responsibility to others that you include within your own story, because they have no say over it, right? You've sort of just brought them in.
I see all of that in the New York Times piece, the accusation that there are multiple registers of truth that you're wrestling with. The essay closes with the answer, I think, that you say you wish you'd given to a question you received in an early job interview. What is the responsibility of the creative writer to truth? And you talk about being honest, that honesty requires an audience, it requires a relationship, a connection. That piece is also, the accusation is also a detective story. You're trying to find who is this guy who's lying about you, and how can you make the truth known? How can you make the truth of the situation, which is your truth, but it's also the objective truth, because this guy was making all of this stuff up. How can you make that known? And then I saw that a few days ago, you said something on Twitter about, because Marta keeps being invited into all of these support groups for people who are falsely accused, we want to say that we do believe in believing anyone who comes forward to say that they have been sexually harassed or assaulted. So there are multiple chasings down of truth in that essay and its aftermath. And that piece, you say, now is going to be a part of the new book, the Autobiography of Shadow. So what does that piece do in that project? How does it center some of the larger themes that you're working with?
Well, I really liked what you just said about this idea of the essay being a sort of detective story in which the goal was to ultimately have our truth out there. But you said this idea that it was a personal truth, but also an objective truth. And that is something that through that experience, I think when we have these questions in our head, and I've had, this sort of question in my head for a long time about what is truth, what does it mean to be truthful or honest, etc. in my writing. And then you have an experience like that where somebody has lied about you in such a sort of calculated way with documentation and this sort of elaborate system of lies that felt at one point impossible to unravel. It felt like, how could we ever, and I think I say that in the essay, that how could we ever get beyond a sort of he said, she said, this idea that, okay, well, there's these stories here, and then there's this other side here, in which we often assume the truth lies somewhere in between. And I realized that the only way to do it would be to sort of show that the entire thing was fictional, right? To show that there was somebody behind this sort of man behind the curtain, sort of mastermind, to be able to identify him. And there was a really sort of revelatory moment for me where we had this sort of factual connection that showed this man had orchestrated all these identities in order to bring these accusations against Marta. And it was a moment where I really appreciated a hard fact that I think that sometimes I feel like I can get so intellectual thinking about what is truth, and facts are contingent, and I have all these thoughts about facts that are very interesting and intellectual, etc. But there was a moment where we had a piece of paper that said that somebody was behind all this, therefore our truth could come out, and that felt really revelatory, because I realized that, yeah, facts also do exist, and they're really important, and it can create moments where we have this sort of objective truth, even though there's other moments where things can be much more messy. So the way that story works in with the book is that the book itself is about, it started out as a teacher I had in high school who taught me philosophy and got me sort of interested in questions of truth, like what is truth, what is beauty, etc. All these sort of large questions that we think about when we think about introductory philosophy. And then by the end of my high school career, became a sort of a conspiracy theorist, And my break with him was when he sort of introduced the idea of Holocaust denialism. And so my book had been originally just about trying to work through that. What does it mean to have somebody be so influential and really open your eyes to the potential for philosophical thought and for these bigger questions, and then be so destructive and use misinformation in order to lead people astray. And so the book was about that. But as I was in the middle of writing the book, this experience happened to Marta and me, and I realized that experience was in some ways an answer. There was that idea of the solidness of the fact, and a lot that came out through that experience of Marta in some way answered these huge questions that I've been grappling with since I was 15.
Wow.
So that's how they speak to each other in some ways.